What kind of things are you really interested in? And I think like it's really interesting like listening how you got into the space.
Sure. Okay, that's a broad question. What am I interested in? I'm interested in trying new stuff. I find it incredibly refreshing to do stuff that I'm not necessarily used to, and I also realize that if you try a sport for the first time or you try a new activity for the first time, your rate of growth and learning is
Yeah.
oftentimes fastest at the beginning. So that's kind of my goal at the moment, is to expose myself to as much as possible, with the longer term view being I can kind of upskill myself, I can fill my bucket of knowledge, and then from there I can see what I enjoy doing, because it's very difficult looking forwards to try and suss out what will give you energy unless you're actually immersed in doing that activity. So what I'm up to now and what interests me is just trying a lot of different activities, different businesses, different events, and pushing myself out that comfort zone a little bit to try and identify what interests me most, and essentially where I want to spend the rest of my career, or at least the initial couple of years or so.
You know, I always find on LinkedIn like you do these like random challenges or like some of the craziest challenges, like writing with my left hand. Would love to know actually digging deep, like how do you come up with these, or like what kind of necessarily is the purpose? So like I understand you said going out of my comfort zone, but I'd like to know more in the sense like what do you usually come out as like the outcome when it comes to trying these new things out?
Yeah, sure, of course. Yeah, to a lot of people, it might seem a bit strange that I set myself the challenge for 1 week to use only my left hand, so my non-dominant hand. And again, the challenges that came with that, I mean, even stuff like showering with a left hand, it just feels strange at the start. And it's interesting how your body kind of becomes accustomed to it in some senses over the course of the week. It would be quite interesting to kind of take one aspect of that challenge and see if I can continue doing that left-handed, and obviously how that progresses, and that rate of growth. But as I alluded to earlier,
Yeah.
that whole process of doing something that just doesn't quite feel right at the beginning, because I think that's with anything, as humans, and I've said this before, Jenny, but as humans, our instincts or our survival nature is to do stuff within our comfort zone. And that comes back from our ancestors. If we were to go out to another tribe, or it's dangerous, right? We could die. And I
Mm.
think that that has carried over among generations. And even as we've evolved, we like to do stuff that's familiar to ourselves because it's predictable. But now we kind of live in some senses, in a comfort crisis, whereby just because it's familiar doesn't necessarily mean it's best for us.
Mm.
And this is the point, is actually you can train doing stuff that is unfamiliar and uncertain. And if you kind of train that as if it's a muscle, as if you're going to the gym, you're training arms,
Yeah.
you're still training that muscle, it means that I'm much more receptive, responsive, and resilient to challenges or difficulties that may be thrown at me in everyday life. Whereas I feel that someone who may not necessarily have trained that muscle as much may find it slightly more difficult to adapt as smoothly and transition to that situation or scenario. So yeah, ultimately a lot of these challenges I set myself are for personal growth, and just to kind of train that muscle so that
Mm.
I'm able to better cope with kind of life's everyday challenges, if you will.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. But then there's that thing, what I've really realized from talking to people, some people that are necessarily in their comfort zone, and it feels like some of them, they don't necessarily want to grow. Like, for example, like I think I have a friend and their whole entire ambition is to become a lawyer. They graduated, they did internships and everything in university. They graduated, became a lawyer essentially, and then they're not actually looking to even do better in a sense or be promoted. I think they've reached their end goal so much so. But then there's other professions like a doctor where your end goal is to become a doctor. So like for people like that, what would you say? If would you
Sure.
say like how do you think they would benefit from like going out from their comfort zone, or necessarily how do they even go towards their comfort zone, or like even people who don't really sorry, long question. But some people don't
No,
even have the
sure.
incentive to go outside of their comfort zone. So what would you really say to these people?
Yes, I completely get your drift. So I understand where that question's coming from. It's difficult to answer because we all live in bubbles, and some people's bubbles are bigger and more broader than others. They capture a greater environment, but ultimately, in that, is you're still in the bubble. So, comfort zone is exactly that. People tend to want to reside in it, and it's really difficult for me to say. It depends on the person's position and their stage of life as well. I believe there's a quote, and I'm going to butcher it, so I'm going to kind of say it my
Yeah.
own way, whereby life's kind of greatest achievements,
Mm,
or a lot of people will set themselves goals and achieve them, which is great.
mm,
But in some senses, that's a failure because it's better to
yeah.
set higher, more ambitious goals and never reach them. Because as soon as you set yourself that ceiling and you've reached that point,
Mm,
it's more challenging to create another ceiling and then build off
mm,
from that. And there's often an element of friction required to do so. So,
yeah.
like, and there's also there's a disconnect because if I'm trying to describe myself as a person,
Mm,
how I would describe myself varies from moment to moment. For example, if I describe myself after just waking up out of bed,
yeah.
I'll probably give myself a different impression than say if it's midday after I've done all of my exercise for the day. So I do
Mm,
think that we kind of vary, and it's about being in that right headspace. So ultimately, to get in that right headspace to make that decision, you need to make
yeah.
sure that you're in good health, and health is very much wealth. So it's a
Yeah.
case of looking after yourself, making sure you're getting a good sleep, to try and
Mm,
identify and actually get to know yourself better, because a lot of the times we don't we only touch the surface. What we're aware of is just what's conscious in the in that part of the brain, but we don't necessarily know ourselves fully. And
mm,
this is why I was speaking about earlier, actually pushing yourself out of those boundaries, and that really just helps to get to know you better. There's a whole concept of neuroplasticity where you evolve and you change over
yeah.
time, but a prime example would be, and I'll touch upon this for maybe 2 minutes or so, is when you're like sleeping and you wake up. And for
Mm,
me, for example, this morning I woke up and I did an Ironman distance swim. And
yeah.
I woke up and I didn't want to do an Ironman distance swim. I woke up and I was thinking to myself, like, oh, I could really do with a little bit longer in bed. But this is the issue, I suppose, is the fact that, I mean, to anyone listening to this, if you've done a run or you do sport or exercise,
Mm,
unless you get injured 99% of the time, or at least 95% of the time, you feel better afterwards. So
mm,
the headspace that you're in when you're straight out of bed, I've never gone for a run and been like, I really regretted that. I wish I would just kind of stayed in bed. Sure, there's getting a balance between making sure you get enough rest time, etc. But I would definitely say that it's about keeping the promises you make to yourself, which is really important. So say
self
if you do set yourself that ceiling, and this is one of the things that I find really interesting. If you basically set your alarm for a certain time in the morning, what
mm,
you've done is the night before you've set yourself a promise, and you've basically told yourself, I'm going to wake up at whatever time you decide to wake up. And if you hit that snooze button, essentially you're invalidating or you're breaking that promise you've set yourself.
mm,
That may seem very superficial on the kind of surface level. It may not seem too much of a big deal, but what that
mm,
does is that kind of plants a seed of doubt in your mind that you don't actually stick to the stuff that you tell yourself that you'll do. And if you really think about that, it's incredibly powerful, because if you do meet the promises you set yourself consistently, persistently, that builds up your confidence, that builds up your self belief, that builds up strength of character. But most of all, that means that whatever you set yourself, or whatever goal you set yourself, or whatever ceiling you set yourself in the future, you're much more likely to attain and achieve, because you've got that past evidence and past history. A lot of people speak about imposter syndrome. And for me, imposter syndrome is you haven't necessarily built up enough concrete evidence in your past in order to go about with that inner self belief. So I would definitely say, and I know this is kind of veered away from the question, but
Yeah.
just to loop it back, I would say that it's really difficult. Some people might be content where they are now, and that's absolutely fine. One of the ways to know you're content is to actually dive deeper, do some introspection. You can do meditation, you can do self reflection, and
Sure.
actually write down your goals. But ultimately, kind of taking a step back, it really does depend on the individual as to kind of how they're feeling. But there's many strategies to push yourself out of that comfort zone.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the word self-integrity isn't actually thrown around enough as it should. Like we throw around words like ambition, growth, this kind of stuff, determination. But I don't think we go inside ourselves enough. So when we use the words like self-integrity, that just means staying true to yourself, right? You can make promises to other people and not keep them, and it's like a very surface level thing. But like you said here, each time you don't keep a promise to yourself or to other people, it adds a little seed that whether you can do it or not in the future. And I think you kind of need to build up your own self confidence, um, and just knowing that you'll be actually consistent with your future self and the stuff that you want to do in itself. And I think that's like a really important point to make. And yeah, it's just
Yes,
thinking,
and to add to that, it's a case of when you do say if you're going to meet a friend, or you're going to go out for the day, and you tell your friend, or you tell your family member, or you tell whoever it is you're supposed to be meeting with, it'll be great to catch up soon.
yeah,
That's a very vague kind of promise, and I definitely think that it's worth either recommitting or decommitting to anything that's on that kind of surface level line, because that does tend to eat
mhm,
away. But you've hit the nail on the head. I think it's very much that integrity, being able to
yeah,
keep your word. I think that's a real sign of good
yeah.
character as well. Is vital.
I think in a way, thinking more from like a binary, the way that I've kind of started thinking was more on a binary perspective. So, not thinking when there's some gray ground, like uncertainty, especially when it comes to making plans, I feel ridiculously stressed out. So, it's not because of the fact that um, I have plans, but it's more on the fact that I don't know whether I have plans or not. So, the way that I've started thinking is like putting it into either A or B. So I have plans for certain, or I don't have plans. But if it's in the middle of I'm unsure whether I have it, it feels like it's a lot more mental load onto things. And I think one thing is though, like we need to feel comfortable with uncertainty. But when it comes to like making decisions, if we can best like concrete it in when we are able to. So if like you have like a long to-do list, it's the reason why it makes you feel less overwhelmed, and it feels a lot better when you write down everything you need to do and also write down the things that you can't control. And the things that you can control is because it adds in almost that binary amount of things that you can see it from a perspective on, yes, I can do this, yes, I can do this, but nothing in between. But in our minds, like there's so much gray in our minds that it just causes, I guess, like the best way to say it from myself is like mental load. It feels like I have more work, but I than I actually have. But if I lay it out, it's a lot easier to see things on paper.
For sure. And in your case, it might be laying out and being overwhelmed by how long that to-do list is. But absolutely, yeah. I think offloading and being able to kind of filter that information, and the practice of writing it down
Yeah.
means that you have to process it a little bit more in a more refined sense. So yeah, I totally understand where you're coming from. It's great that you're already ahead of the game in doing that.
I mean, like, I think as well, I had a conversation with someone, and like, you were someone who came on top of in my head, essentially. We were talking about the concept of a multipreneur, where the idea, it wouldn't be necessarily a generalist, but the idea of someone who does multiple things. And it was the question of, do you think that there are more people that do multiple different things? Or is it just the bubble that we're in?
really good question. Okay, so as you've alluded to, I see. So it's a T. Okay, so you
Mm,
have the top or the top part of that T is the breadth, and then the bottom is the depth. At this current stage in my life, I'm thinking a lot more about the breadth of experience, and the reason I say that, and the concept of multipreneur as well, doing lots of things in tandem or in conjunction. I have
mm,
two thoughts on that. One is good and one is bad. So the good part of that is you gaining experience in two distinctly different industries.
mm,
You're never going to be the best. You're kind of seen as a jack of all trades. However, you may be the best in the intersection. So if you think of a Venn
yeah,
diagram where those two circles overlap. So for
yeah,
example, I may be really good at chess. I'm
mm,
not particularly good at chess, but I may be really good at chess, and I may be really good at uh, like having lots of creativity or that
yeah,
entrepreneurial mindset, right? So I'm not ever going to win a chess tournament. I'm never going to may not never be that kind of Elon Musk or Bill
yeah,
Gates or whoever you want to kind of brand that title to as the best entrepreneur. But what you
mm,
can do is you can combine the two disciplines together, and actually you can be very creative and think of lots of strategies that are maybe less orthodox but are still effective in a chess game. And
mm,
that beauty of having that crossover is actually really really interesting, and it's something that actually you've got that depth when it comes to those two disciplines together. So that's my one thought. My second thought, which is negative about multipreneur, especially when you're out getting started. I know a lot of people who tend to have one business, one enterprise, and once that then tends to do well, it becomes a bit of an umbrella, and other enterprises spawn underneath that. But ultimately, I think the one thing that you need at the start, and the one thing I've felt guilty to, actually time and time again, is having that focus on one discipline and being able to go completely in on that. Because I realized that, so I mean, it's like anything really. If you are going to get stuck in and focused on a task, you can
mm,
have say 2 hours deep work, like solid working with your mind in the game, and that will return you 2 hours on that investment. Or say if it takes you 30 minutes to familiarize yourself with that task, it will give you
mm,
1.5 hours of output. So the problem with trying to do lots of things in tandem is oftentimes you'll need that readjustment period to get your head back in the game, as
yeah,
opposed to once you've made that initial investment of that 30 minutes, you'll be able to stay productive that day. Whereas if you
mm,
change in disciplines, oftentimes you're not necessarily in that headspace, you don't have that focus as much. So it means that you might have to spend 30 minutes on task A, 15 minutes on task B, 30 minutes
mm,
on task C, and then you've suddenly spent an hour and 15 minutes, 45 minutes down compared to the person who's just focused in on that one task. So, I mean, getting a balance is important. When the stakes are not as high, I think that
mm,
actually doing lots of things is quite good just to give you exposure and give you that learning. But ultimately, if you really want
mm.
to succeed in a certain discipline, it's like the Olympics, right? You never really see too many, well, at least that I know, that are fantastic across disciplines, is because they stay focused and hone in on one particular discipline.
Mm. I think, like, in a sense, the strong point is this whole entire world, it feels like it goes towards more specialists, if I'm honest. I think that's what I struggled with, like, when growing up, because I had so many different interests. Like, I tried pretty much most sports, I tried, like, pretty much most weird hobbies, even got into, like, bow making from my mom, excessively making 40 bows. But in a sense, like, sorry, cut this out. But I think it comes from the perspective on, like, not only just like from childhood but also doing many different things. So like it can go from like coding to necessarily trying to think data analyzing to just more, I would like to say, artsy stuff, crafting, writing, that kind of stuff. But I think in a sense, it just gave me a lot of breadth. And like coming from like a STEM background, where it really does emphasize on being a specialist in your kind of area. And I think universities are even kind of pushing that like hyper specialization onto you as well, within like the whole entire idea of like going to school for one subject and then just furthering on that education path on where if you get like a bachelor of science, most likely you would get another bachelor of science. I mean, not a bachelor of science, a master's and a PhD. Um, and so it feels like the whole entire world does like hyper focus on these specialists, especially in the entrepreneur space in itself. So, like for example, EF, they look for highly technical people who are very hyper specialized in one area. I mean, I guess that's my kind of experience with them, and it's a question on like how do generalists leverage these like specialists, because the way that I've kind of leveraged things is by because of the fact that I have so much breadth, I can connect the hyper specialized people and be able to make it like easier to understand to non hyper specialized people.
Sure.
And like usually what I find is, I'm not trying to say hyper specialized it's a bad thing, but as well, um, for example, Imperial, supposedly someone is telling me that they have a high percentage of people with autism,
Mm,
just simply because of the fact that you usually are able to like hyper focus on one thing. But I think in a sense, like coming from such a hyper specialized kind of background or surrounded by so many hyper specialized people, I've realized a lot of the soft skills kind of go under noticed. Which I think is like where the generalists really fill in. Like I think they're almost like the yin and yang to each other.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Just to build from that, having the two working together is, and with anything, any business needs a team. I do believe that you need a certain amount of specialist knowledge, because
Mhm, yeah.
ultimately in any business you need to be more knowledgeable than your customer, right? So
Yeah.
that means that you still, or there needs to be some sort of knowledge gap there,
Yeah.
or somewhere that you can fill in the gap that your customer's looking for. So there's got to be some sort of demand, which makes obviously sense. So if you take a role
Mm,
of an accountant, for example, you need someone to be able to be financially literate and to understand the processes tied with filing accounts. So I would definitely say that there's having a certain degree of specialism is helpful, but ultimately, if you're a leader, you can't be too specialist. You need to actually understand what your team are doing across those different departments and disciplines. I would definitely say that that kind of leadership role is more tied to that generalist. Sure, you may be able to have specialist experience and bring that in. It's important that you at least understand what your team are doing around you.
mm,
However, the generalist whole sense, I don't think that that is. I think that that's absolutely fine. And this is the thing: some people enjoy focusing on that one discipline. They do a
yeah.
PhD in a certain discipline, and this is how research moves forward and how we advance. How we
Mm,
advance as a race. Of course, you need people to specialize. But an example would be in computer science. As a generalist, if you don't know about coding and stuff like that, it makes it very difficult to be able to bring your vision into reality. You often need
mm,
people who can help you do that and are more focused and more efficient. Because ultimately, if you're specialized, it means you're more efficient. Especially as an entrepreneur, you tend to be trying to do everything at the start. You're trying to do your accounts, you're trying to do your
yeah.
marketing, you're trying to do your operations, you're trying to, I don't know, like manage yourself and manage your time. There's just so many factors that fall into that, and ultimately, I I've got the belief that if you value, you've got to put a value on your time as well. At the start, it's slightly
Yeah.
different, but ultimately, if after a year, say if you value your time at, I don't know, say £20 an hour, right? If you can pay someone to do a task you really don't want to do for less than £20 an hour, then you should absolutely do that. And that's the ideology: is you just want to become more efficient. If it's a task you need to repeat over and over again and you need to have a little bit more literacy about, then yeah,
Mm,
maybe it's a worthwhile investment, putting your time and effort and energy into upskilling yourself. But an example would be, I took my bike to the shop the other day to get
mm,
some tri bars fitted on the front, and it would have taken me probably about 2 hours of 2 3 hours of labor trying to suss out how to put them on. But ultimately, I could go to a shop and they would fit that, and they wouldn't charge the
yeah.
labor; they would just charge me for the bars. albeit they do
I,
inflate the
I
price of the bars, but it's still a good investment on time, I would say.
I think, in a sense, people don't actually realize the value of their time. So, having like a coffee chat with someone is absolutely like, yeah, yes, you get a lot of knowledge out of it, but then you come to a point, I think, within this journey where you start needing to value your time a lot more because of how many calls you have. Like, for example, I know you and I both usually have back to back calls, and what I find is that your time, what is it, minimum wage is what, £10 or £12 an hour or so. So that means that call has to be worth at least £6. And I don't like putting amount of money on time, but then also I think people don't value like the amount of knowledge exchanged from talking to someone. So what I found was, like, I guess more mentoring other students and kind of just giving my advice on what I would do in their situation when it comes to like entrepreneurship. I think if I have like a 2 hour conversation and if it leads someone to the right direction, then I think in a sense that knowledge is valuable in itself. So I think realizing the importance of people is something that feels like it should be a bit more emphasized, because the way we talk about business, it feels like it's heavily emphasized on like money or resources.
Mm,
But I think another thing is that people don't really emphasize enough is like the importance of both a network and relationship building with people, and how much like people can actually influence you within your business itself. And like the more I'm in the industry, I'm realizing like you can do so much with just people. You don't need to make a business off of nothing. You can make a business off of nothing. Like, it's crazy how much like the emphasis, the amount of importance about money, but like the amount of impact you can just make with simply people is just absolutely astounding. Like, I think about this every day now recently, and it's just, yeah, it's just amazing just thinking about it.
mhm. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Actually, I mean, there's two factors to the response. The
Yeah.
first factor is centered around, yeah, if you can do some, I mean, it's really difficult to be able to track the return on investment. It's not like you put in some time and then you're suddenly able to see the top
Mm.
line of your business go up
Yeah.
by a certain percentage, or you're not able to see that money in your bank account, etc. I think the time best well spent is spent on yourself and that personal development. And like you said, if you're mentoring someone, or supporting someone or helping them out, sometimes you're never gonna get that result, or which is really difficult, especially when
Yeah.
you're got limited hours in the day and you're trying to decide where to allocate that time to. But ultimately, I know this from personal experience. There's been a couple of words or a sentence or things that have been said to me that actually are so, how do I say, so minor that they wouldn't have realized that it was so powerful, but it resonated a lot with me. And an example would be my head teacher, my previous head
Mm.
teacher is, well, when I was junior school anyway, was absolutely fantastic. He every lunchtime he used to go outside and he used to play cricket with the children. I remember going to cross country tournaments and I was in his passenger seat and we had the music on and the windows open. He was just an incredible character, and it's now come round to myself, age 20, and I was reflecting on my past and essentially what got me here, and
Mm.
oftentimes those nice experiences. And I actually reflected and I was like, this man has done an incredible amount for me, and he's never really seen the benefits of that because I
Mm.
graduated, I finished school, and I moved forward. So I thought it'd be really nice to reach back out and essentially pay my thanks. And we've got a meeting set up next week, which should be really cool, and I'm looking forward to. Andy Howard, Belmy Junior School,
Mm.
incredible person. But this is the point. Like, you often don't necessarily will get that touch point, and that's something that you just kind of need to internalize. And a lot of it is going off your gut instinct. What do you think is doing right? I was at an effective altruism conference
Mm.
last week now, yeah. And the idea was actually it's about trying to work out how to do the most good in the world if you want to pursue that path. And ultimately, if you've got one career that is helping one person, and then you've got the option to pursue another career which is helping 100 people, even though that one person is great, the 100 people, you're 100 times more effective. Just think about that. That means the average person doesn't live for 100 years. So in
Mm.
that 1 year, you could have achieved the impact that few people would see over the course of their entire life. So a lot of it is about prioritization and trying to,
Yeah.
yeah, trying to kind of narrow down and also work out what's important to you, because that will vary from person to person. I actually forgot the second half of that question, and I'm not 100% sure if that answers your question.
I just
Just
kind
let
of,
me know
it's
if
because
I've missed any out.
it's like a completely casual conversation, I guess. Like, I think this is kind of the stuff that I find most people like interested in the most, actually, just like the most authentic kind of casual conversations. And I guess they're also the most fun to kind of record as well. But I've realized kind of within like the past, what, 5, 6 years, that I do always help people, but at the same time, I've realized the importance of like not just my time in general when it comes to giving advice or mentorship. That I used to be like the type of person that wanted to help everyone and kind of be the support that I didn't have before. But what I've realized is like some people cannot be helped. They kind of need to help themselves, because before you can even help themselves, like I think necessarily like even helping people out when it comes to entrepreneurship, you can tell them what they have to do and stuff like that, but whether they'll do it or even listen, like I think that's like a completely different story. And it's
Lead
like
a
that.
horse to water, but you can't make it drink.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of more of a caveat to that, actually. So you can either you can lead a horse to the water and they'll be willing to move all the way there, but they won't internally change whatsoever. They'll completely go back to their old ways. And I've started realizing you can try to teach someone a mindset and this kind of stuff to think this way or anything that would benefit them, but until they actually do it themselves, they have to actually be ready and prepared for themselves to make that change. And it comes to the point where I'm thinking like, okay, so how can I make the most impact and how can I most help the most amount of people? And it's actually just finding people who are ready for have that mind mind shift already, like that they're actually wanting to put that change in themselves. And I think if I can help, if do I have to force one person to make that change within themselves, or can I just help 100 people rather and put that effort into 100 people? And the answer seems quite obvious to me. And I think realizing it's not as common as people think it is, on this whole entire mindset that they actually want to help themselves or want to solve this problem. It's a lot more than that. Like it feels like it's actually a smaller percentage of people that I'm encountering.
Sure. I see two fronts. So the first being, I personally believe education is incredibly important, because
Okay.
when you're helping that person out, or you might be changing that person's life for the better, you're not just changing their life for the better, you're changing the people who they interact with.
Yeah.
And suddenly that filters through to so many more people. If I hadn't had good mentorship and hadn't been driven and hadn't
Mm,
been motivated to see change around me, we wouldn't be having this conversation. A lot of the societies that I may have done may not have happened in that particular way. Like, it's really difficult to be able to quantify the benefit of helping one person, and
yeah.
just anything in general is quite difficult to try and put a figure or try and put a number on something. But like, there's two things you mentioned there. One, I truly believe that
Mm,
I that people know the answers.
mm,
They know how to improve their lives. They know, if you want to get a six pack, you should go to the gym and you should be consistent.
mm,
This is the thing though. If you take something like a six pack, right? You know how
mm,
to do it, right? You don't necessarily have that. Maybe you don't have a personal trainer. You don't have that motivation or accountability partner or whatever. But
mm,
it's not a secret how to do it. You just need to put the hard work in. And because that's still in your head, it's much easier to scroll through TikTok or Instagram. You see these kind of body, you're like, you know what? I'm going to wake up tomorrow and I'm going to start working out. But the thing is, when you buy your gym membership, they don't give you a complimentary six pack. You have to put in the
Yeah.
work and the effort, and this is ultimately the balance. There is the people who I'd want to work with the most, or the people who I think that my time would be best spent helping, are those
Mm.
people who already are putting in that hard work, right? Who
Yeah.
already put in that time, who are already trying to better themselves, but they just need a platform, or they need an introduction, or they need a connection, or they just need a sounding board, or they need a mentor or a partner, or something like that that I can add to them that will be able to make them do that faster and better, which is the
Mm.
whole idea. Like, there's lots of people out there. I'm sure, like, some people might find this unsettling in some ways to listen to it, but honestly, you know what the answer is, or at least you know the direction you should be heading in. It
Mm.
is your job, and it's my job, and it's other people's job in this ecosystem to try
Mm.
and help them along their way. But like you said, we're not going to lead a horse to water. That's not what we're here to do. We're
Yeah.
here to, I don't know, get a bucket and make that process when the horse is drinking slightly easier, right? But it's not about getting that horse to water. Ultimately, you can do
Yeah.
that yourself. And if not, you're just a lazy horse. I'm sorry to say.
Yeah, I can't agree with that. Like even more so, like there's a difference between just ignorance versus like just not know. Like there's a difference between ignorance, right, and also just knowing the answer and you just don't want to do it in itself. Like I think everyone knows a lot of their solutions to their problem, and like there's that saying like look in the mirror, the biggest like what was it, look in the mirror, you're the biggest solution to your problems. And most of the time that's actually quite true. Like you think about it, right? Like if you're thinking like grades wise, like you know what the solution is, study more. Sometimes like there's most of the time you know the solutions internally, and it's just pretty much like you need to change the way that your mindset, whether it be like actually putting the work in. um yeah, sorry.
No, no, absolutely. I mean,
I feel
a lot
like
of it is also trying to be effective with your time and
yeah,
spend that well. I think and it's always difficult because, say, if you take education and studying, sometimes the answer isn't
yeah,
necessarily study more. Sometimes it can be counterintuitive and it can be study less,
yeah,
which is something that that's not like endorsing that at all, but it's just something I realize is sometimes like when I have one-to-one conversations, I do my best to try and block out like 15 or a little bit of time afterwards, so I have
yeah,
time to reflect. Otherwise, it's just like sometimes it can be like, oh wow, I'm getting all of this knowledge. It's going in the brain somewhere and it'll get used. But what I found is it goes in the brain somewhere and then it just kind of disappears. And with any knowledge, really, or anything you do, a lot of it is about that reinforcement. And getting started is often like
the
half
hard.
half the challenge. It's there's like an analogy where it's learning.
Mm.
It's talking about those uh, neural 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 pathways in your brain, right? When you first hear something, imagine you're kind of in like a field or a swamp somewhere, and
Mm.
you're trying to traverse that. And then when you hear it again, when you start to write about it, that kind of field, you start to build a little bit of a mud path, and eventually that expands out into kind of a walkway. And then when
Mm.
you start to repeat that, speak about it, and teach it to other people, that then
Eh.
starts to expand out into a B road and an A road and eventually a motorway, which means that you can access that information like
Mm.
literally with the click of your fingers. I can't click my fingers, but you can access it quite quickly. So it's
Mm.
yeah, I think for sure it's one of those things that it's a process. It's not going to happen overnight. You just got to have that willingness to want to do something different. We talked about comfort zones at the start of the talk, right? If you're
Yeah.
already happy and you're in your comfort zone, there's no one pushing you out of the chair. There's no one telling you what to do. If you're content like that, that's fine. You're not moving. You're grounded if you're that horse. But ultimately, if you do want that change to happen, and you're kind of like on the edge of your seat, you're dipping your feet in the water. That's
Yeah.
exactly where you should just jump for it. And a lot of the stuff, if it doesn't
Mm.
make sense to you, or I got to frame this because I don't want it to be taken out of context.
Yeah.
But if it feels like it is hard or difficult or doesn't really make sense, or your brain's coming up with excuses, that's our
Mm,
defense mechanism. That's our little voice in our heads, which is
mm.
fantastic at coming up with excuses. And when those excuses are the most
Yeah.
convincing, that's exactly when you should take action.
I think, like, as well, one thing I kind of wanted to say was there's a reason why the 1% is the 1%, or there's a reason why the 10% is the top 10%. I was thinking about this earlier. And there's a bunch of rich, wealthy people that somehow they were born into like wealth, and they are able to establish such large like rankings in a way. And you think about that versus like someone who was like self-made, and it would be like if it was a competition, who would win. And I truly believe that the people who get outside of their comfort zone and they actually work their way up, they would always actually outcompete the person who was born into things. And I think, like, in a way, people who were always like kind of pushing outside of their comfort zone, they're not actually they're always going to be consistently growing. And I think, in a way, there are people who are naturally going to become the top 10% or 1%. I think that might just be like just me babbling on, to be honest. I realized that we went over the 30-minute rep.
Of course. Yeah, if I conclude and make like
Yeah.
a final remark there, it's all. So I spoke to someone yesterday, and his
Mm,
father told him something really simple. If it comes down to career and it comes down to health, you should always choose health every single time.
mm,
And this is the point: is that top 1%, that top. You see this with athletes all the time. They tend to peak in their
yeah.
early teens, and sometimes the best performers end up fizzling out, and they don't necessarily make it to
Mm,
those competitions when they get to late teens, early 20s. So
yeah.
a lot of it comes down to how much can you sustain it, and that ties into the health, which we were speaking
Mm,
about earlier. But ultimately, it's not the only person you're competing against. Yes, you might have the top one, the top 10%, but it also depends on the metrics you're assessing. That is that
yeah.
wealth, is that happiness, how are you defining happiness, is that relationships. There's just so many factors, and
The
you
amount of
you think
sacrifice.
about this, of course. So a lot of it is just a case about being content with where you are and realizing that you're
Mm,
absolutely blessed to be here right now. I'm
yeah.
absolutely blessed to be, I mean, even I've won the lottery, right, to be born in the UK, to be having this conversation, to be speaking to
Mm,
really cool people. So ultimately, it doesn't matter where you are or even like how difficult your life may seem at the moment. You are
mm,
blessed to be here, and that's difficult to hear. It's difficult for me to hear when I was going through stuff, but ultimately, you kind of
yeah.
know it's true, and you've got that decision. You've got your life ahead of you. You're in
Mm,
control. You're the master of your own destiny, and I think
yeah.
that's probably a good point to leave it off. Is really it's about you. It's about introspecting what you would like out of your life, because
Mm,
really you can get there. And this is the one thing I've figured is in order to
yeah.
get there, you basically need a couple of ingredients. That's good people around you, and
Mm,
by being yourself and by being that person you want to be,
mm,
naturally, if you're the top one or the top 10%, people look at you like, they're top one, top 10%. They like to
yeah.
kind of dig at you. This is why you get a lot of celebrities and you get a kind of negative publicity. But for
Mm,
me, it's almost like you can't really comment on someone who has obviously achieved success and fame, and it's difficult
mm,
to criticize, right? Like, or it's easy to criticize them sitting
mm,
down in your comfortable chair in your bubble, right? So ultimately, you've got to make a decision, because a lot of people, like, they're only the top one, the top 10% for a reason, right? Because they're exactly that. So it's up to you as to how you think and reflect. And maybe I might change my mind in a few years' time, but from all of the
yeah.
evidence that I've been presented with, I genuinely think it is completely in your control. And obviously,
Yeah.
people have different starting points, but that end point has never been defined.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's actually quite exciting, like the fact that you are in control of your own destiny. Because some people can actually see that negatively, that like the issue, the problem is themselves, but at the same time, the solution is also yourself as well.
That's really powerful. That's incredibly powerful. But yeah, Jenny, it was an absolute pleasure chatting, and hopefully this has been helpful in somewhat to people. I'm not sure if we'll clip it up or we'll just release it in the full version. But it was great chatting as always,
Yeah.
and yeah, looking forward to staying tuned, seeing everything that you're going to go on to achieve, because I think the future's bright as long as you kind of look at it from that angle, for sure, to self
Mm.
actualize.
That's quite true. It was lovely talking to you as well, and we'll definitely we're probably gonna message sometime within this week as well.
Fantastic. Awesome. Good
Okay,
stuff.
thank you for everything. Bye.